The Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has urged us all to buy Australian made, and honestly, I would love to. But what Mr. Albanese failed to mention is that he, along with all of his predecessors for at least the last 20 years, is the reason why I can't afford to buy Australian made. And I'm not the only one. My name's Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I help people like you to understand the world as it changes around you. Anthony Albanese says, buy Australian made, like it's just a simple choice, as if we can all afford to walk down the supermarket aisle and buy the thing that has the Australian made symbol. And I wish that were true. But the only symbol I'm looking at when I shop these days is the dollar symbol. Perhaps posting buy Australian made makes sense when you're a Prime Minister on a $400,000 per annum salary, plus perks, of course. But for the rest of us out here in the real world, the cost of living in Australia means that we have no spare cash. And the cost of doing business in Australia means that Australian made is synonymous with expensive. It wasn't always this way. I'm old enough to remember when Australia had a vibrant, for example, textile industry. We didn't have to import all of our clothes from the subcontinent. I'm old enough to remember when we had 8 petrol refineries in Australia. Now we have 2, so we have to re-import our petrol after sending the oil overseas to be refined. I'm old enough to remember when we didn't just have our own car manufacturers, we had 4 of them spread between South Australia and Victoria, and they didn't just make cars for Australia, they made cars for export markets too. What happened? How did we get to the point where not only are we uncompetitive on the export markets, but we can't even afford to buy our own products here in Australia? What happened? In a nutshell, the cost of government happened. People say that manufacturing in Australia is unviable because wages are too high and labour is so much cheaper elsewhere, but that is only partly true. The problem is that the cost of everything is sky high, and that's mostly because of government intrusion. Take energy, for example. It's one of the most fundamental inputs into an economy. Expensive energy drives up the cost of living for every Australian, causing us to demand increases in pay from our employers and also to cut back on discretionary spending, which then makes it harder for business. So now Australian businesses have to find more money to pay the higher wages that we're demanding, whilst also selling less product because we can't afford it. Plus, they then have to pay the high energy costs themselves, all of which means that their input costs for their products and services is higher than their competitors overseas. They lose exports because they can't compete, then their volumes go down even more, they become even less competitive, and now you can see that a death spiral has begun. And that's just one of the ways in which government has destroyed Australian businesses. Let's look at industrial relations, or basically the rules around hiring people. Not only do you have an Australian system of award wages so complex that oftentimes even the government departments themselves get it wrong, but you've also got an enormous amount of unproductive costs associated with hiring people. There's all the paperwork, the lawyers, the HR departments, the work cover contributions, and the payroll tax. And then, of course, the ever present risk of industrial disputes and lawsuits. Frankly, it is amazing to me that anyone in Australia hires anyone at all. The risks of employing people here in Australia are so great, and the productivity oftentimes is pretty low. And then we can add the cost of real estate. That warehouse or factory space that you need for that manufacturing business that you've always wanted to start. You'll be paying top dollar for that. In a country which restricts land release and imposes fees and charges on construction that routinely add up to 50% of the construction cost or more. Then there's the myriad of licenses and permits that you'll need in order to run your business. There's the fees you'll pay, the taxes you'll be slugged with, all for the privilege of doing business in Australia. And then, if by some miracle you do actually manage to turn a profit in this country, the government will come to you with its hand out telling you to pay your fair share. It's no wonder that local manufacturing simply cannot compete with imports. Now, some people look at this problem and they conclude that we need to protect local industry. We should put tariffs on imports. And this has become an especially fashionable idea in the age of Donald Trump 2.0. But whilst protecting local industry can sound like a pretty good idea, we know from experience that it only makes things worse. And that's because protecting an industry doesn't fix the underlying issue of uncompetitiveness and the cost of doing business. And in fact, it makes it worse in two key ways. Firstly, protection allows a business to become even less competitive than ever, because once you start protecting them, their incentives change. Without protection, their incentive is to be efficient, to deliver a better product at a better price. But once the protection comes into play, their incentive now is to actually keep begging the government for more handouts and more protection. And how do you force the government to give you what you want? Well, you show how much you're struggling, of course. Once government protection is in place, the incentives flip on their head, and the business no longer wants to thrive, it wants to struggle. For exactly the same reason that the incentive of every government department is to always use all of their budget and then need more, and oh, we need more staff too. Protecting an industry or business turns it into a welfare dependent parasite. We saw that, for example, with the Australian car industry, which received both protection and enormous subsidies and became an increasingly voracious parasite on the Australian economy, whilst still failing to produce export worthy vehicles. But secondly, protecting an industry actually makes the cost of living situation worse for the rest of the population. You see, for as long as the cheaper imports are available, people can save money by buying that cheaper import. Sure, that sucks for the local manufacturers who can't compete with those imports, but it means that people have a way of reducing their living costs when they need to. But once you tariff the imports to make them just as expensive as the local goods, all you've done is raise the cost of living on everyone. That means that they now need to tighten their belts elsewhere. They don't magically have more money. They have to find the extra money for those products that are now protected with tariffs from somewhere else. So what happens? Well, now suddenly there's other Australian industries that are struggling because people just don't have the money anymore. So what do? Well, those industries now go to the government for protection or for welfare as well. And before you know it, the entire economy is depending on government protection, government support, or both. And we know this is what happens because it's been tried before lots of times. And this is how it always goes. So, if tariffs aren't the answer, what is the answer? Is it just to open up to free trade and watch Australia inevitably lose what little manufacturing we have left and become completely dependent on a flood of cheap imports? No. There's no reason why we can't buy Australian made. We just need to fix the problem at its root rather than fiddling with the symptoms. We need to reduce the input costs so that manufacturing is once again viable here. We need to reduce the cost of living so that we can afford the luxury of paying a little bit extra for local products if we want to. And that means we need to deal with the problem at its root, which is government. If the cost of energy, regulation, and taxation are the fundamental reasons why our manufacturing is uncompetitive, then it's pretty obvious what we need to do. Firstly, we need to fix the cost of energy. Now, Australian brown coal is among the cheapest sources of energy in the world, selling the energy wholesale for often less than 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So instead of spending billions on unreliable renewables that then need subsidies and all the batteries to make them semi reliable, we should instead spend the money on maintaining, upgrading, and even building the latest, most efficient brown and black coal power stations. Number two, we need to slash regulation. We need a doge in Australia, but not only on spending, on regulation as well. It is absolutely unconscionable to me that we have so many laws, so many rules and regulations that no human being is capable of knowing all of them. It's almost got to the point where it's too late to reform our regulatory system. It's really only possible to just delete the whole thing and start again. But regardless of the method that we use, we need to get regulation in this country down to the point where it occupies no more than a few hundred pages and can realistically be read, understood, and remembered by a normal human being. And point three, we need to cut the cost of government at every level. Most people think that the cost of living is out of control, but actually it's the cost of government that's out of control. Government now costs a median Australian full-time salary earner more than half of their salary every year. Think about that. If you're earning, let's say, $75,000, you only get the spending power of $37,500 after you've paid all the various taxes, duties, rates, excises, fees for licenses and registrations, and compliance costs. Is it any wonder that you can't make ends meet on half a salary? And then to make matters worse, because you still cost your employer that $75,000, plus superannuation, which you don't get to spend, plus their payroll tax, HR departments, all the other costs and legal fees that go along with employing people in Australia. That business has to set their prices so that they can recoup all of those costs. And yet you're trying to buy products using only half your salary. No wonder it's hard to make ends meet. No wonder we can't afford to buy Australian. So my message to the Prime Minister is simple. I'd love to buy Australian, but you're the reason why I can't afford it. So stop your moralistic social media posts and start fixing the costs of doing business and fixing the cost of living so that we can all afford to buy our own products again. Who knows? If we get this right, we could start exporting to the world again and see Australia proudly standing on its own 2 feet again. I remember a time when we did, and we can get back there. But it starts with Anthony Albanese and all the rest of our political parasites from both Labor and Liberals fixing the problems that they have created. Then we can buy Australian. My name is Topher Field. This is the Topher Project. You can get my books and merch from goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. Please like, subscribe, comment, follow me via @TopherField on all the socials, and I'll see you in the next one.